Hello, welcome back to Business Bedtime. If you are listening to this right now, you are probably already in bed. Maybe you have your eyes half closed. Maybe the room is dark and quiet and still. That is exactly where you should be. Tonight we are going to talk about something very calm, something very slow, something that moves at the pace of a minute hand on a very expensive watch. We are going to talk about Rolex and the way they have quietly, slowly, patiently built a system that makes certain watches feel like they are almost impossible to find. But we are going to take our time with this story. There is no rush. There is nowhere to be. Just let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you are resting. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw relax. Good. Let us begin. Zara Livre Zaro. Segment 1. The factory in Biel. Imagine a factory. Not a loud factory. Not a busy, clanging, rushing factory. A very quiet one. This factory sits in a Swiss town called Biel. Sometimes it is written Bien, which is the French version of the name. Biel. Bien. Both names for the same quiet place. The town sits near a lake. The lake is still and flat and reflects the sky. On clear mornings, you can see the Alps in the distance, far away, covered in snow that does not move. And in this town, there is a building, a large modern building with clean lines. The walls are smooth. The corridors are calm. The air inside is controlled. The temperature does not change. The humidity does not change. Because dust and heat and moisture are the enemies of a very small mechanical thing. And inside this building, in rooms with filtered air and steady light, people in white coats sit at benches. They sit very still. They hold tiny tools, and they assemble watches. Each watch has hundreds of parts. Some of those parts are smaller than a grain of rice. Some are thinner than a human hair. A person sits at a bench. They pick up a tiny piece of metal with a tool called a tweezer. They place it carefully in a slot. They do not rush. They do not hurry. They have done this same movement thousands and thousands of times, and so their hands are very steady. Their breathing is slow. Outside the window, it might be raining, or snowing, or sunny, but inside the building, it is always the same. Quiet, still, controlled. Rolex has been making watches in Switzerland for a very long time. The company was founded in 1905. That was over 100 years ago. In those 100 years, they have made millions of watches. And yet, if you walked into a Rolex store today and asked for one of the most popular models, the person behind the counter would very likely look at you and say quietly and politely, "We don't have that one available right now." They might offer you something else, a different model, a different style, maybe one with a different color face, or a different kind of bracelet. But the one you came in for, the one you had been thinking about for months, not available. And here is the strange thing. Rolex makes hundreds of thousands of watches every single year. Some estimates say around 800,000. Some say closer to 1 million. So why can you not simply walk in and buy one? That is the question we are going to sit with tonight. Slowly, gently, without rushing to the answer, because understanding this story requires understanding something about how value works, and how scarcity works, and how a brand becomes something more than just a product. But for now, just imagine that factory in Biel. Imagine those quiet rooms, those steady hands, those tiny tools. Imagine the watches being assembled, one careful piece at a time, in a building next to a still lake, under a sky full of slow-moving clouds. Everything happening very, very slowly. Just like this. Segment 2. The birth of desire. Let us go back in time a little. Not too far. Not to the beginning. Just back to a moment when Rolex watches started becoming something more than just tools for telling time. For most of the 20th century, a watch was a practical object. You wore it because you needed to know what time it was. You wore it because there were no phones in your pocket, no screens on your wrist, no clocks on the wall of every room you entered. You wore a watch because without one, you were lost in time. And Rolex made very good watches, very reliable ones. Watches that worked in cold water, watches that worked at high altitude, watches that worked in the heat and the dust and the rain. In 1953, a man named Edmund Hillary climbed to the top of Mount Everest. He wore a Rolex. The watch worked perfectly at the top of the world, in the cold and the thin air, where most things stop working. That story spread slowly, the way all good stories spread, person to person, year to year, and over time, Rolex became associated with something, not just with keeping time, but with surviving, with succeeding, with reaching the top of things. Explorers wore them, pilots wore them, divers wore them, presidents wore them, and slowly, the watch on your wrist became a way of saying something about yourself, without saying anything at all. You just held out your hand, and there it was, the crown logo on the dial, and the person who saw it understood something about you, or thought they did. Now this kind of desire is very powerful. It is more powerful than need, because need can be satisfied. If you are thirsty, you drink water, and the thirst goes away. But desire built around identity and status? That kind of desire does not go away so easily, because you are never quite finished becoming who you want to be. And Rolex understood this, or at least, they behaved as if they understood it, which is the same thing. So they made very good watches, and they attached those watches to powerful stories, and they let those stories move through the world, like water moving slowly through stone. And over time, something interesting happened. The watches started to hold their value, and then they started to increase in value. A watch that cost $2,000 new might be worth $3,000 used, might be worth $4,000, might be worth $5,000. And this made people pay attention, because most things you buy lose value the moment you buy them. A new car is worth less the day after you drive it off the lot. A new phone is worth less the moment next year's model is announced. But a Rolex might be worth more in 10 years than it is today. That is a very unusual thing, and it made people think of watches differently, not just as something you wear, but as something you keep, something you pass down, something that holds time in a different way. And while this was happening in the world, quietly, in that factory in Biel, the people in white coats kept sitting at their benches, kept placing tiny pieces of metal into tiny slots, kept not rushing. The watches kept being made. But somewhere along the way, something in the balance shifted. The number of people who wanted the watches grew faster than the number of watches being made. Or at least, that is one way to tell the story. There is another way to tell it, and we will get to that. But first, just rest for a moment. Let that image settle. The factory, the quiet rooms, the steady hands, the watches accumulating value, like water accumulates behind a very slow dam, everything moving at the pace of a second hand, making its way around a very expensive dial. Tick, tack, tick, tackabirdi arbidasor. Tick, tack. Segment 3. The waiting list and the gray market. Now we arrive at the part of the story that happens not in the factory in Switzerland, but in stores around the world. Imagine a store. It has large glass windows. It is very clean and very quiet. The lighting is soft and warm. There is no music. Or if there is, it is very low, barely there. In glass cases along the walls, watches sit on small cushions. Each one is lit from beneath or from above. Each one gleams. You walk in, a person greets you. They are dressed very neatly. They speak quietly. You tell them you would like to see the Submariner, or the Daytona, or the GMT Master 2. These are models with names that sound almost like adventures. Submariner, Daytona, GMT, names that carry the weight of all those old stories. The divers, the pilots, the racing drivers, and the person behind the counter looks at you and says, gently, we don't currently have that in stock. And you ask when it might be available, and they say they are not sure. This is the waiting list, except it is not always a formal list. It is more like an understanding, a relationship, a quiet negotiation. To get a highly sought-after Rolex from an authorized dealer, you often need to have a history with that dealer. You need to have bought things before, maybe other watches, maybe jewelry, maybe straps or accessories. You need to be a regular, a known person, someone who has demonstrated loyalty. And even then, you might wait. You might wait months. You might wait a year or more. And while you are waiting, you are also becoming more and more attached to the idea of the watch. Because the things we wait for feel more valuable to us than the things we get immediately. This is a very human thing. The waiting makes the wanting bigger. And so by the time the watch is offered to you, you want it more than you did when you first walked in. Now, while all of this is happening inside the authorized stores, something else is happening outside. There is a world called the gray market. The gray market is not quite official, but it is not illegal either. It exists in a comfortable space between the two. On the gray market, people sell Rolex watches that they bought through official channels at prices higher than what they paid. A watch that cost $10,000 in the store might sell on the gray market for $15,000 or $20,000, or for the most sought-after models, much more. People who manage to buy from authorized dealers sometimes sell immediately. They call this flipping. They stand in line, or they cultivate a relationship with a dealer. They pay the official price, and then they sell it for more on the secondary market. And this creates a very strange situation, because now the watch has two prices: the official price, which is on the paper inside the box, and the real-world price, which is what someone will actually pay to have one today. And the gap between those two numbers becomes itself a kind of advertising, because when someone reads that a watch sold at auction for 3 times its retail price, they think this must be something special, and they want it more. Now, here is where the question becomes interesting. Did Rolex plan all of this? Or did it just happen? Or is the truth somewhere in the middle? The company has never officially confirmed that they deliberately limit production to create artificial scarcity. They say they make as many watches as they can, while maintaining their standards of quality. And this is probably true, at least in part. Making a Rolex is genuinely slow and difficult. Those rooms in Beale with the filtered air and the people with the steady hands are not pretending. The quality is real. But it is also true that a company that makes nearly 1 million watches a year has the resources to build more factories, to train more people, to make more watches, if they wanted to. And they have chosen, over many decades, to grow production slowly, very slowly, at a rate that always seems to stay just behind demand. Just slightly behind? Not so far behind that people give up and buy something else. Just far enough behind that the waiting list stays real, that the gray market stays active, that the desire stays just slightly unsatisfied, like a fire that is kept burning, by feeding it just enough wood. Not too much, not enough to let it die. Just enough. And whether this is a deliberate strategy or a very fortunate accident, the result is the same. The watches feel precious. They feel rare. They feel like something that not everyone can have. And in a world full of things that everyone can have, that feeling is worth an enormous amount of money. Just let that thought settle quietly, like dust settling in a still room. Segment 4. The vintage market and the long sleep of value. Now we move to the part of the story that is perhaps the most interesting and also the most slow-moving, and therefore, in some ways, the most calming to think about. The vintage market. Vintage, in this context, means old. Watches that were made decades ago. Watches that someone wore for years or decades and then sold or gave away or passed on. Watches that have lived their own small lives. In the world of vintage Rolex, something remarkable happens. Watches that were made in the 1950s, or the 1960s, or the 1970s are not just preserved, they are celebrated, they are studied, they are bought and sold for extraordinary amounts of money. A watch that a factory worker in 1965 might have bought for the equivalent of a few weeks' wages might now be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some of them are worth millions, and this is not random. This did not happen by accident. It happened because of a combination of things that work together very slowly over a very long time. The first thing is genuine rarity. Unlike new watches, which Rolex is still making, the vintage ones truly cannot be made again. There are only as many 1963 Rolex Daytonas in the world as were made in 1963. No more will ever exist. And over time, some are lost. Some are damaged beyond repair. Some are sitting in a drawer somewhere, forgotten, not yet found, so the number that exist and are available gets smaller with every passing year. That is genuine scarcity, not manufactured, just time, doing what time does. The second thing is the story. Every vintage watch has one. Who wore it? Where it went, what it survived. There is a famous story about a Rolex Daytona that belonged to the actor Paul Newman. He wore this watch for years. It was a gift from his wife. It had a particular kind of dial that people had not paid much attention to for most of the time it existed. But because Newman wore it, and because Newman was a certain kind of person, the watch became special. When that watch was sold at auction in 2017, it sold for more than $17 million. $17 million for a watch. Now that is an extreme example. Most vintage Rolexes do not sell for anywhere near that amount. But the story illustrates something important. The value of these objects is not just in what they are, it is in what they represent. And what they represent is built over decades, through thousands of small stories, accumulating slowly, like sediment at the bottom of a still lake. The third thing is the ecosystem. Around vintage Rolex, an entire world has grown up. There are dealers who specialize in nothing else. There are auction houses that hold dedicated sales. There are magazines and websites and podcasts devoted entirely to the study and appreciation of old watches. There are collectors who spend years finding a specific reference number, a specific dial variation, a specific combination of parts that makes one watch different from another. That looks almost identical. These collectors speak a language of their own. They talk about tritium dials and matte surfaces. They talk about tropical dials, which are dials that have changed color over decades of exposure to sunlight, turning from black to brown to caramel, a color that took 50 years of patience to achieve. And they pay more for that color because it is proof of time. Imagine that, paying extra for damage done by the sun over half a century because what looks like damage is actually evidence. Evidence that the watch was real, that it was worn, that it was lived with. That time actually passed. And here is where the story becomes most interesting for us tonight. Because Rolex, even in its vintage chapter, even in watches that are 50 and 60 years old, still benefits from the scarcity system it has built. When the new watches are hard to get, people look to the secondary market, and some of those people discover vintage watches, and some of those people become collectors. And more collectors means more demand, and more demand against a supply that can only shrink means prices go up. And when prices go up, Stories are written, and when stories are written, more people become interested. And when more people become interested, more people want the new watches. And the new watches are hard to get, so they go back to the secondary market. It is a slow circle, moving like the hands of a watch, always returning to where it began. Now you might wonder, is this a good thing or a bad thing? That is a question worth sitting with. For the collectors, who have spent years accumulating watches, and who have seen those watches become more valuable, it is, in a financial sense, very good. For the person who just wants to buy a watch and wear it, it can be frustrating. For the dealers in the gray market, it has been very profitable, at least during the good years. And the good years were remarkable. Between around 2020 and 2022, the market for luxury watches, and especially vintage ones, went through a period of extraordinary growth. Prices climbed very fast. A watch that was worth $10,000 in 2019 might have been worth $25,000 by 2022. This drew attention. It drew investors. People who had never worn a watch in their lives began buying watches as financial instruments, as things to hold and wait and sell for more, and this made prices go even higher. But then, as often happens when something rises very fast, things began to slow down. By late 2022 and into 2023, the market began to cool. Prices came down from their peaks. Some gray market dealers, who had bought watches at high prices, found they could not sell them for what they had paid. The circle kept turning, but slower, and in a different direction for a while. And through all of this, Rolex kept making watches. In those quiet rooms in BL, those people in white coats at their benches, still placing tiny pieces of metal into tiny slots, still not rushing. The world outside might be moving fast. Prices rising, falling, rising again. Collectors arguing about reference numbers. Investors refreshing market data. But in the factory, the pace does not change. There is something almost comforting about that. The steadiness of it, the patience. And maybe that is part of the appeal. In a world that moves very fast, there is something deeply reassuring about an object that refuses to rush. That was made slowly. That was designed to last 100 years. A mechanical watch does not need batteries. It does not need software updates. It does not become obsolete when a new model is released. It just needs to be wound or worn, because the movement of your wrist keeps it running. Your heartbeat, in a small way, keeps it alive. Segment 5. The dealer, the collector, and the passing of time. Let us imagine a person. We will call him Marco. Marco is in his early 50s. He lives in a mid-sized city. He works in some kind of business. The exact kind does not matter. When Marco was in his 30s, he bought his first Rolex. It was not the most expensive model. It was a simple one, a stainless steel case, a green dial, the kind of watch that looks the same at a business lunch as it does on a weekend hike. He saved for it for almost 2 years. He bought it from an authorized dealer. The dealer wrapped it carefully and put it in a green box, a dark green box, the color of pine trees. Marco drove home with the box on the passenger seat. He did not open it until he was home. He sat at his kitchen table and opened the box very slowly. The watch was on a small green cushion. It caught the light from the lamp above the table. The second hand was already moving. The watch had been started before it left the factory, days or weeks ago, and it had been keeping time ever since. Marco put it on his wrist. He looked at it for a long time. Over the next 20 years, Marco wore that watch almost every day. He wore it to important meetings. He wore it on vacations. He wore it on the day his daughter was born, and the hands of the watch recorded that exact moment, even though no one was looking at it. Time passed, and the watch worked second by second, tick by tick, and something interesting happened. The watch became more valuable, not just to Marco personally, because of the memories attached to it, but objectively, financially. The model he had bought was now worth significantly more than he had paid for it. And one day, Marco read a magazine article about vintage watches, about how certain models from the 1960s and 1970s were selling for enormous amounts of money, about collectors who traveled the world looking for specific pieces, about dials that changed color and were now worth small fortunes. And Marco became curious. He began reading more. He found online communities devoted to this. He learned the language, reference numbers, dial variations, case conditions, the difference between a watch with all original parts and one that has been serviced with replacement components. He learned that originality matters enormously, that a watch with all of its original parts, including the hands, the dial, the case, the crown, is worth significantly more than an identical-looking watch, where some parts have been replaced over the years. And he began to think of his own watch differently. He thought about what it would be worth in another 20 years. He thought about whether he should buy more, whether he should look for older ones. He began visiting dealers, not just to buy, but to look, to learn, to hold watches made in different decades, and feel the small differences in weight and texture and finish. He became a collector, quietly, slowly, without really deciding to. He bought a watch made in 1968. It had a particular kind of dial that was slightly different from the ones made in 1969 or 1970. The difference was subtle. Someone who did not know what to look for would not see it, but Marco saw it, and that seeing made him happy in a quiet, private way. And now Marco has several watches. He keeps them in a case lined with soft material. He takes them out sometimes in the evenings, when the house is quiet, and he winds them and looks at them under a good lamp. He is not rushing. He is not selling. He is just sitting with them, the way you sit with something you love. And in those moments, the question of whether Rolex manufactured this desire, or whether it is genuine, does not really matter to Marco, because the feeling is real. The weight of the watch on his wrist is real. The sound the rotor makes when you turn the watch is real. The way the light catches the polished surfaces is real. The desire for beautiful, lasting things is very, very old. Older than Rolex, older than Switzerland, older than clocks. Rolex did not invent that desire. They just learned to work with it. The way a river learns to work with the shape of the land, flowing slowly in the direction things naturally go. Segment 6. What scarcity actually is. We are getting close to the end of our story now. And before we arrive there, let us spend a few quiet minutes thinking about what scarcity actually is. Scarcity is one of the oldest ideas in economics. It simply means that something is limited, that there is not enough of it for everyone who wants it. Most things in the natural world are scarce. There is only so much land, only so many diamonds under the ground, only so many blue whales in the ocean. But some scarcity is not natural. Some scarcity is created. A company decides to make fewer things than people want, or it decides to sell only through certain channels, or it creates conditions where having one of its products is difficult enough that having it becomes an achievement. This is manufactured scarcity, and it is very effective, because desire is not just about the object. It is about what getting the object says about you. If something is easy to get, it says nothing about you. You simply got it. But if something is hard to get, if it requires patience and persistence and connections, then getting it says something. It says you have what it takes. And this is exactly the feeling that luxury brands have always sold. Not the object, the feeling of having arrived, of having been patient enough, of belonging to a group that is not open to everyone. Now, is this manipulative? Perhaps, in some sense. But people also genuinely enjoy these feelings. The desire to be part of something special is real. The pleasure of owning a beautiful, well-made object is real. The satisfaction of waiting a long time for something and then receiving it is real. Rolex did not create these human tendencies. They just understood them very well and built a system that works with them. A system that has been running for more than a century, getting stronger with each passing decade, more entrenched, more self-reinforcing. The new watches are hard to get, so they hold their value on the secondary market. The secondary market makes headlines, which draws more people into the story. More people in the story increases demand. Higher demand makes the waiting lists longer. Longer waiting lists make the watches feel more precious. More precious things are harder to get, and harder to get means they hold their value. And so the circle keeps turning, slowly, steadily, like a watch movement. All those tiny gears turning each other, each one moving the next one, in a system designed to keep perfect time for as long as it runs. There is something almost beautiful about it. Even if you see it clearly, even if you understand how it works, you can still look at a well-made watch and find it beautiful. Understanding a thing does not always make it less wonderful. Sometimes understanding makes it more. Segment 7. The auction room at midnight. Let us go somewhere quiet now. Imagine an auction house, but not during the day, when the room is full. Imagine it late at night, after the sale is over. The chairs are empty, the spotlights are dimmed, the people have gone home, and the watches have gone to their new owners, traveling in small boxes, wrapped carefully, moving through the dark to wherever they will live next. The room is very quiet. On the walls, there might be photographs, images from previous sales, a watch photographed on a white surface, perfectly still, a watch that once belonged to someone famous, a watch that recorded the seconds of someone else's life, and now it belongs to someone new, and in 10 or 20 years, it might be sold again. Watches move through time differently than people do. People age, people change, people eventually stop. But a well-made watch, cared for properly, can keep going. The mechanism repaired when needed, the crystal replaced if it cracks, the bracelet polished. A Rolex made in 1960 is still running today. It has passed through different hands, different wrists, different cities, different chapters, and it is still keeping time, still marking the seconds. Tick, tack, tick, tack, tick, tack, dime. There is something very peaceful about this, about an object that simply continues. That does not need anything from you. That just keeps doing the one thing it was made to do, keep time. And in a way, that is what all of this story is about. Time. The time it takes to make something well, the time it takes for value to accumulate, the time it takes for desire to grow, the time it takes for a watch to become vintage, the time it takes for a strategy to become a tradition. All of these are slow processes. None of them can be rushed, and maybe that is the final lesson of this story. Not just about watches, but about anything that holds value. The things that last are usually the things that were made slowly, with care, with patience, with attention to small details that most people would not notice. The things that people want most are usually the things that are genuinely hard to make, or genuinely hard to find, or both. And the companies that understand this build something more than a product. They build a world, a story, a feeling, a quiet promise that if you are patient enough, something good is waiting for you. Whether or not that promise is entirely kept is another question, but the promise itself is beautiful, and it keeps people watching, waiting, hoping. Just like we hope, each night, when we close our eyes, that sleep will come. And it does. It always does.